Staying with me here at the anchor desk, Newsmax magazine executive editor David Patten. Joining the conversation, Ross Eisenberg, Vice President of Energy and Resources for the National Association of Manufacturers, and a gentleman who we often talk to, who I don't think minds the characterization of being left of center. From Newsmax, New York, it's our friend Rick Ungar. Gentlemen, we welcome you all to this discussion.
Hey, JD. A fair description, by the way.
Well, good. I'm glad we'll start at that point of agreement. Let me begin with Rick. Rick, this situation seems to be just another example of the president using executive authority to get what he wants. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, but that's what executive authority is for. I'll tell you what I find a bit perplexing about the situation. I quite frankly don't think that cutting those emissions over 30 years is such a terrible idea. What shocks me is that the president would choose to announce it now, knowing that this is going to make life a lot tougher for some important Senate races in some very key districts like Kentucky, like Alaska, just to name it two, where coal industry is a very big employer. I don't quite get why he wouldn't hold off until December or January for this, and I can't seem to get a very good answer on it.
Well, let's turn to Ross Eisenberg, because Rick is suggesting, Ross, that this long-term view is plenty of warning time, and while Rick is expressing concern politically in the short term, is that 15-year window really all that long?
Well, to answer Rick's first point, I actually agree with him. There's a 120-day comment period on this that ends right about the time of the election. So it is very curious timing, and I think about 120 days from now, there's going to be some people maybe grinding their teeth over this one. But to your question, 120 or 15-year time frame to get to 30% reductions, we think is a pretty significant lift for the power sector and in turn for the manufacturing sector. Again, manufacturers aren't against reducing emissions. We're for reducing emissions. We're for being more efficient, but we need to do it in a way that preserves our energy policy, our all-the-above energy strategy. This looks a lot more like a means to an end, which is to get rid of fossil fuels.
So I wanted to jump in and go back to Rick real quick. David Patten here, Rick. Isn't the reason, the underlying motivation, if you will, for bringing this in now, really sort of just a few months ahead of an election, that the environmental left is so influential, so powerful within the party, that this will help motivate and rev up not only the base, but perhaps more importantly, the donor base. And in return, effectively, the administration is giving up as sacrificial lambs, if you will, any chance in West Virginia, perhaps Kentucky, some of these other major states.
Well, I got to be honest with you. That was my first thought. Here's the problem that I see with it. Number one, the environmental lobby within the Democratic Party, yes, they're substantial, but it's not like they are donors to the point where this is something that's going to make a difference politically in the outcome. So while I thought at first, okay, that deserves consideration, your point precisely, I don't really see it. I really don't. You're not going to take the Senate back in some of these critical states by working to the environmental interest, because it's not enough money. It's not as big of a lobby as sometimes some people like to make them out to be. Yes, they have some potency, no question, but no, I have to answer your question with a big no. It's not enough to make this make sense to me politically.
So we come back then, Rick, to the ideological factor for President Obama. Perhaps he feels, in terms of his own political survival, that he survived, I believe it was a dinner with the editorial board of the San Francisco Chronicle, where, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I'm happy to get the correct paraphrase or maybe the direct quote if you remember, his intention was essentially to get rid of the coal industry in the United States. He's been elected president twice since making that statement and hasn't had an effect on his personal electoral fortunes.
I know the statement that you're making, JD, where I would take some issue with what you're saying. His political survival, let's be frank, as much as people like to run around and go, oh, impeach the president because they don't like him, he's going to survive the rest of his term. He does not have to run for election again. So I think we can take his political survival off the table. We can discuss his ideology, that's fair game, and maybe this is his ideology, but I come back to the question, why not wait until December or January? I mean, let's face it, if you add another couple of months on the back end of this 15 years, it's not going to damage his ideological point of view. This is where I get perplexed. I understand that the president is not a big fan of coal. Quite frankly, while I hate to see any job lost, I think our technology has advanced to the point, particularly with the steps we've taken with natural gas, which have been brilliant. I don't know why we can't move on to that better source of energy. I'm just perplexed by the political impact of not waiting a few months to say it.
So, Mr. Eisenberg, David Patten here. I wanted to ask you a question about the economic impact. We had seen a Chamber of Commerce study that said this could cost $50 billion and perhaps 250,000 jobs roughly per year over this entire period. But that was based on a model that's indicated we were going to go down to actually increase to 42% reduction in emissions, so a larger increase. What will be the economic impact here?
So, according to EPA, it's anywhere from 5 to 8 billion annually. You saw the Chamber's numbers, which were upwards of about 50 billion annually. It's probably somewhere in between that, and I would wager closer to maybe the Chamber's numbers. And this is an important point that goes to both coal and natural gas. The policy that we're on does not just stop at coal, and that's again why manufacturers are so interested and so concerned here. It puts us on the path to not only curb coal power, but also natural gas-fired power. And it may not happen immediately, but again, that's the way this policy works. There's a precedent for that's being set here, where a lot of the decisions they're making on coal right now, in really 8 years, 10 years, we're going to be having that same discussion on natural gas. So it's not as
why is that, Ross? I'm curious.
So there's two reasons. The first is, well, on the new power plant rule, they've locked into place, and this is the one that proceeded today, they've locked into place a standard that basically says the best system of emission reduction that's adequately demonstrated is carbon capture and sequestration. And for policy reasons that probably make a lot of sense, because they were knocking the legs out of coal, they didn't want to do that to natural gas. But now we have a precedent that's in place that says the carbon capture and sequestration is readily available, that is commercially available. I mean, we know it's not, but that's what the law now is going to say. So every 8 years, you're supposed to redo those rules. So in 2022, we're going to be having this discussion. It also actually gets more interesting when you consider in the context of the rule that came out today, because generally speaking, if you look at some of the modeling the Chamber and others have done, it retires about, a quarter of our coal fleet, but at the same time, the gas fleet would ramp up, and then it would ramp up additionally on top of that to meet additional energy demand. So as that's happening, the emissions are still coming out. I mean, natural gas emits about half the CO2 emissions as coal, but it still emits CO2 emissions. So in 2022, and this is what Chamber got into in their study, in 2022, we're going to be having a real push to start mandating carbon capture for natural gas, which then makes natural gas more expensive. This was also.
Let's let Rick respond to this, Ross. Go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, I got to point something out. And Ross, I've been sitting here thinking you're a pretty straightforward guy, which I appreciate. But something you're saying is why I think that people get a little bit suspect when they hear an industry group talking. How could you possibly predict what we'll be talking about in 8 years? You don't know who the president will be. You don't know who will be in Congress. There are so many things you don't know that prediction just has absolutely no basis to it. You may be right. Maybe we'll be talking about it in 6 years. Maybe we'll be talking about it in 10 years. Maybe we'll never talk about it at all. But you see, when you make a prediction like that, people who are actually listening to what you're saying start scratching their head. Do you think if we have a Republican president elected next that we're going to be having that conversation in 8 years? Do you think if the EPA is wiped off the earth, we're going to be having the conversation?
Only have about a minute left. Ross, very quickly, your response, 15 seconds.
I do, and I make that statement as a lawyer. I mean, that's what the statute requires. It's called shall language. EPA shall do X, Y, and Z. It's non-negotiable at this point. It wouldn't take much more than a lawsuit from an environmental group to force the issue, much like it did under the Bush administration when we were dealing with this.
We have to change anything.
Ross and Rick, we appreciate it. Rick, the other thing I'd point out, in my experience, you have something called bureaucratic inertia. The bureaucracy decides no matter who's in the White House or who's in Congress, they're going to continue it. So that's the watchword and the concern. Gentlemen, thanks to you.
I don't necessarily buy it when it comes to natural gas.
I understand what you're saying,
Most administrations have
Rick.
been in favor of it.
Well, I understand that. We'll see about that, and we look forward to having you both back. David Patten, we thank you as well. Your take on this, Obamacare via the air or for the air or cap and trade? Why don't you tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum. John Bogman back with headlines in just a minute.